Welcome to Data Science for Ecologists in R. In this short video, we will have a look at the first things you should do after importing your data into R, and we will learn how to structure and summarize our data. When working with R, one of the first things you should always do is to clear your global environment. This will just get rid of variables that you have saved from previous sessions, and this is always good practice to do in the very beginning. Then before importing our data into R, we will have a quick look at the classes of variables. So in R, variables can have different classes. For example, we can save a variable, we call it some text, and this is then saved, and we can check the class of this vector by just typing str some text. And this will give you the output here, where you can see that it is a character vector and it has 4 entries. And there are other classes. So for example, you could save other variables that are numbers. So for example, here we can save some number and some other number. And when we check the structure, we can see that this is numeric. And the class of a variable has consequences. So for example, if our variables are numeric, this means that we can do math with them. So for example, we can just add those numbers and R will calculate the result. With character strings, we cannot do math. So if we try to multiply some text with 2, this will give an error. It's just R's interpretation. So for example, we could also save numbers as other classes. So here, for example, we can save the number 2 as a character. If we structure it, you can see that it is interpreted by R as a character, and this means we cannot do math with it. And if we try, it gives us an error. And this is very important to keep in mind, and we always need to make sure that R interprets the variable as the class that we want it to be. So let's keep this in mind when we import our data. So in the next step, we will just load our data. And we will just do this with the read.csv function. And this will load our dataset. So there are different things what we should do after importing our data. After importing, there's different things we can check. So one of the first things we can check is whether the number of observations and the number of variables make sense. Then we can look at the head of our data by just typing head dt. This will give us the first few rows of our dataset. And here we can now see that we have site, species, year, the plot, height, width, and the leaf area. And they all seem to look okay. We can then look at the structure of our data. The command for this is just str and then dt for our dataset that we want to structure. And this will now give us a sort of a summary where we can see the class of all of our variables. So here, for example, we can see that site, year, and plot are integer values. And species, height, and species is a character vector, and height, width, and leaf area are numeric. And now we should think about the classes of our variables. So for example, for site, year, and plot. They are now interpreted as numbers by R, but the site here in our experiment rather reflects a labeling of the sites than an integer number. And this is very important because if we would now check, for example, for an effect of site on the height of plants, R would check if sites with a higher number have higher heights. But what we rather want to do is compare different sites with each other, and we do not really care about sites, about the relationship of sites with higher numbers to height. So what we should do is we should change the class of a site to a factor instead of an integer. And the same goes for species and also the plot. And the right class for these variables is a factor. So let's make a factor out of site, species, and the plot. And what we can do here is we can just type as factor, and then we refer to the variable that we want to transform into a factor, and we save it as the same variable. So we do this for site, species, and the plot. And we can check, so if we now check the structure of our data again, we can now see that site, species, and the plot is a factor, and we can also see the number of levels. So we have 4 sites, 3 species, and 2 levels for the plot. Another thing we can do is we can also summarize our data. This will give us slightly different information. So let's have a look at the summary. So when we look at the summary, we get a bit of different information. And this information depends again on the class of the variables. So for example, for factors as site, species, and plot, we get the information of all of the levels and of how many entries we have per level. So for site 1, 2, and 3, we have 8 observations. For site 4, we only have 7. And then R gives us the number of NAs, which is 2 here, which are the number of not available observations. So this is basically missing data in this case. Then we get the same for the species, and here we can already see that something is quite suspicious or something went wrong when entering or reading in the data. We do have 2 empty observations, 15 observations for one species and 16 for the other. For integer and numeric variables, it looks a bit different. So with the summary of those, we get the minimum, the median, the mean, and the maximum value, as well as the first and third quantile. And again, the number of NAs. And this is very important because here we can check whether the range of our variables makes sense with our experiment. So these are a few things that you should always check after importing your data, and to make sure that your variables have the classes you need for the analysis you want to do later on. And with this, we are ready for the next step and for working with our data set.